My daughter knew something was wrong. I could see it in the way she held her wine glass at the dinner table, not drinking, just gripping it like she needed something solid to hold on to. When her eyes finally met mine across the candlelight, she gave me the smallest nod. That was all I needed. My name is Bernard Ashworth. I am 67 years old, and I have spent the better part of 4 decades building something worth protecting. Not just money, though there is plenty of that, but the kind of family structure that takes a lifetime to construct carefully, brick by brick. A trust. A legacy. The kind of thing you build not for yourself, but for the people who come after you. My daughter, who I will call my girl throughout this because that is simply how I think of her, is 34 years old. She is sharp, kind, and in the years since her mother passed, she has been the steadiest person in my life. She works in sustainable architecture in Vancouver, she volunteers at the food bank on Saturdays, and she has never once asked me for anything beyond my time. When she called me 2 years ago to tell me she had met someone, I heard something in her voice I had not heard in a long time. She was happy. Truly, quietly, deeply happy. His name was Patrick Lorne. He was 41, she told me. A financial consultant based out of Calgary. Divorced once, no children, and from what she described, he was the sort of man who always knew the right thing to say at exactly the right moment. He had met her at a conference in Whistler. He had walked her to her rental car in the rain because she did not have an umbrella. He had texted her that same evening just to say he hoped she got home safely. I did not distrust him immediately. I want to be honest about that. I am not the kind of father who views every man his daughter dates as a suspect. I raised her to be a good judge of character, and I trusted her judgment. What I felt, those first few months, was more like a quiet static than a clear alarm. Something at the edges of things that I could not quite name. The first time I met Patrick was at Christmas, at my home in West Vancouver. He brought a bottle of Okanagan Red, shook my hand firmly, and spent the evening asking me thoughtful questions about my life. He was charming without being slick. Attentive without being performative. He laughed at the right moments and was quiet at the right moments. My girl watched me the whole evening, trying to read my face. I told her afterward that he seemed like a good man. And I meant it. Mostly. What I did not tell her was that when I went to the washroom midway through dinner, I passed the hallway where Patrick was standing alone for just a moment, and I saw him take out his phone and photograph something on my bookshelf. I could not see exactly what. By the time I came back, he was already seated again, refilling her wine and telling a story about a hiking trip in Banff. Maybe it was nothing. A picture of a book title he wanted to remember. A photograph of something that caught his eye. People do strange things. I filed it away and said nothing. Over the following months, the relationship moved quickly. By spring, he had given up his lease in Calgary and moved into her condo in Kitsilano. By summer, they were talking about buying a place together. She called me every Sunday, and each week there was a new detail, a weekend in Tofino, a dinner party with his colleagues, a trip they were planning to Montreal for the jazz festival. She was glowing. I could hear it. But then came the questions. Not from her. From him. Filtered through her, but originating from him, I could tell because they were the kind of questions she would never have thought to ask on her own. Questions about the family trust my late wife and I had established years ago. Questions framed innocently, always, Dad, Patrick was wondering, just from a planning perspective, what happens to the trust if something were to happen to you? And then a week later, Patrick thinks it might be worth talking to your lawyer together, just so everyone's on the same page. And then, he mentioned that in some families, a spouse can be named a secondary trustee. Is that something you've ever considered? I answered each question carefully and revealed nothing useful. But I started paying attention. I hired a private investigator based in Vancouver. His name is not important. What is important is that he is thorough and discreet, and he came highly recommended by the firm I use for corporate matters. I gave him Patrick's full name, his date of birth as best as I could establish it, and the name of the financial consultancy he claimed to work for. The first thing he came back with stopped me cold. The consultancy was real. Patrick Lauren did appear on their website. He was listed as a senior associate. But when my investigator called the firm and asked to be connected to Patrick Lauren to discuss a high-value client portfolio, the receptionist put him on hold for nearly 4 minutes before coming back to say that Mr. Lauren had been on an extended leave of absence for the past 8 months. No further details. She sounded uncomfortable. 8 months. My daughter had been with him for just over a year at that point. He had been on leave for most of it, and he had never once mentioned this to her. As far as she knew, he was working remotely, taking client calls, managing portfolios. She had never had reason to question it. I asked my investigator to keep going. What came back over the next 3 weeks was not what I expected. I had been bracing myself for a gambling problem, maybe. A second family somewhere. Something personal and painful but ultimately private. What I got instead was a pattern. Patrick Lauren had a history. Not a criminal record, nothing that would appear in a standard background check. But a civil record. 2 former partners, both women with significant family assets, had filed civil suits against him in the past 8 years. One in Ontario, one in Alberta. Both cases had settled quietly. Both women had signed non-disclosure agreements as part of the settlements. Both had been in serious relationships with him, relationships that had moved quickly, that had involved questions about estate planning, that had ended with money missing or misallocated in ways that were difficult to prove but impossible to ignore. There was also a woman in Kelowna. No lawsuit. But my investigator found a forum post on a small community board, dated 3 years earlier, from a username I could not verify. The post described a man matching Patrick's description almost exactly. His habits. His technique. The way he photographed things in people's homes. The questions he asked about trusts and wills. I sat with that for a long time. I need you to understand something about this moment. When you have information like this and the person you love is in the middle of it, still happy, still glowing, still calling you every Sunday to tell you about weekend plans in Tofino. There is no clean way to do this. You cannot simply call your daughter and say, I think the man you love is a con artist who has done this before and you need to leave immediately, because that is not how it works. Love does not dissolve because someone presents you with a spreadsheet of red flags. If anything, the person who presents the spreadsheet becomes the problem. I needed her to see it herself. But first, I needed to know exactly what he was after. I called my lawyer, a man I have worked with for over 20 years, whose office is on West Georgia Street and who has seen my family through everything from corporate acquisitions to my wife's estate. I asked him, hypothetically, if someone were in a serious relationship with a beneficiary of a family trust, what would they need to do to position themselves to access that trust in the event of a marriage? He walked me through it carefully. The short answer was that a spouse could not simply access a discretionary family trust without significant structural changes. But those changes were not impossible. They required the trustee's consent, legal documentation, and time. However, he noted, if someone were willing to be patient, willing to build trust over a year or two, to ingratiate themselves with the trustee, to frame requests as reasonable financial planning, the process was not as protected as most people assumed. He asked me if there was something specific I was worried about. I told him I was just being thorough. Then I called my daughter. I did not tell her what I knew. I told her instead that I had been thinking about getting everyone together, her, Patrick, and my lawyer, just to do a comprehensive review of the trust documents. I framed it as something I should have done sooner, now that she was in a serious relationship and the family's financial picture was becoming more complex. I told her it would give me peace of mind. She thought it was a wonderful idea. She said Patrick had actually mentioned something similar recently. I am sure he had. We set a date for a family dinner at my home in West Vancouver, a Saturday in October, the kind of evening that arrives clear and cold on the North Shore, the mountains already white at the peaks. I told my daughter to invite Patrick. I arranged for my lawyer to join us for the early part of the evening. And I asked a second person to be there as well, a woman who had been connected to me through my investigator. She was the sister of one of the women who had settled the civil suit in Ontario. She had agreed to be present, quietly, as what I can only describe as a witness to character. She flew in from Toronto on a Friday. In the days leading up to the dinner, I made a point of being warm with Patrick. I called him once, midweek, to say I was looking forward to seeing him and that I had been thinking about what he had said at Christmas about getting everyone aligned on the financial planning front. He was smooth and enthusiastic. He said he was really glad I was taking this step. He said he had a few ideas he thought I might find useful. I am certain he spent that week preparing. The evening began the way those evenings always do, people arriving with wine and good intentions, the house warm from the kitchen, my daughter wearing the green dress I gave her for her birthday 2 years ago. Patrick came through the door with 2 bottles of BC Pinot Noir and a handshake that lingered just a second longer than necessary. He was at his best that night. Relaxed, engaged, funny in exactly the right proportions. My lawyer arrived at 7:30 and settled into the sitting room with a glass of sparkling water. The woman from Toronto was introduced simply as an old family friend, which she played perfectly, quiet, observant, utterly unremarkable to anyone who did not know why she was there. We moved to the dining room. The conversation stayed light through the first course. Patrick talked about a property he had been researching in the Comox Valley that he thought might be a good investment opportunity. He mentioned the trust, casually, as context, said something like, with the kind of foundation Bernard has built, it would be a shame not to put it to work in the right directions. My daughter nodded. She trusted him. That was the hardest thing to watch. After the main course, I excused myself to refill the water pitcher, and I made a small gesture to the woman from Toronto as I passed her chair. She looked up and gave me the briefest nod. When I came back to the table, I set the pitcher down and remained standing. I said, Patrick, there's something I'd like to show everyone before dessert, if that's all right. I placed a folder on the table. Inside were copies of the 2 civil suits. The Forum Post, printed. The investigator's summary. And 1 additional document, a letter, signed by the woman from Toronto, describing what her sister had experienced. I did not raise my voice. I did not make a speech. I simply said, I think we should talk about who you actually are. The room went very still. Patrick's face did something complicated. For a moment, just a moment, the mask came off. Not dramatically, the way it happens in films. Just a tightening around the jaw. A slight recalibration behind the eyes. Then the mask came back, and he said, very calmly, that he did not know what I was talking about, that whatever I had found was clearly a misunderstanding, that he loved my daughter and had nothing to hide. My daughter said his name once. Quietly. He looked at her. She was looking at the folder. I watched her read the letter from the woman in Toronto. I watched her face move through 5 or 6 different things in the space of 30 seconds. I did not look away, even though part of me very much wanted to. She set the letter down. She looked at Patrick. She said, is any of this true? He tried 3 different approaches in the space of about 2 minutes. First, denial. Then a version of events that cast him as the victim of a vindictive ex-partner. Then something that I can only describe as an emotional pivot, his voice dropping, his expression softening, reaching for her hand and saying that he could explain everything, that he needed her to trust him, that the 2 of them could work through this together if she just gave him the chance. She pulled her hand back. She looked at me. Her eyes were wet, but her jaw was set. She said, did you know about this before tonight? I said yes. I told her I had been investigating for about a month. I told her I was sorry for not coming to her sooner, and that I had needed to be certain before I said anything. She nodded slowly. Then she looked at Patrick and said, I think you should go. He did not go immediately. He tried once more, a quieter version of the same appeal, directed at me this time, man to man, something about how I had misread the situation, How the investigator I had hired was obviously working from incomplete information. My lawyer cleared his throat from the sitting room doorway. Patrick glanced at him, then at the woman from Toronto, then back at me. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He said, "You're making a mistake." I said nothing. He left. The door closed, and the house was very quiet for a moment. My daughter sat at the dining table with both hands flat on the cloth, not moving. My lawyer came in and quietly poured everyone a glass of wine. The woman from Toronto put a hand briefly on my daughter's shoulder and said, in a voice that was steady and kind, "My sister said the same thing, the night she found out. That she felt like the ground had been pulled out from under her. She also said that she was grateful it happened before the wedding." My daughter looked up at her. "Was your sister okay?" Eventually, she said. "Yes." We sat at that table for another hour. My daughter asked questions, some of them practical, some of them the kind you ask when you were trying to understand how you missed something, how you looked at a person every day and saw one thing when another thing entirely was happening underneath. I answered what I could. I told her the rest was not about her perception. It was about how skilled he was at being whatever the situation required. She cried once, briefly, and then stopped and was angry for a while, and then was mostly just tired. Before she left that night, she hugged me in the front hallway for a long time. She did not say anything. She did not need to. In the weeks that followed, I had my lawyer send a formal legal notice to Patrick outlining the civil documentation in our possession and making clear that any attempt to re-establish contact with my daughter or with any member of our family would result in those documents being shared with relevant financial regulatory bodies in British Columbia and Alberta. We also sent a summary of the investigator's findings, with appropriate redactions, to the firm where Patrick had once been employed. What they did with that information was their business. He did not contact my daughter again. She took 3 months. That is how I think of it. She took 3 months for herself. She worked. She walked the seawall. She spent a weekend with her friends in Tofino. She called me most Sundays, though the calls were shorter for a while and the topics were lighter. We talked about the garden. About a renovation she was considering at her condo. About a show she had been watching. One Sunday in February, she called and she sounded like herself again. Not the version of herself that had been glowing over Patrick, but the deeper version, the one who had been there before him and would be there long after. She asked me how I had known something was wrong, really known, before I had any proof. I thought about it for a moment. I told her it was the photograph. That moment in the hallway at Christmas, when I had seen him take out his phone and point it at my bookshelf. I told her that a man who is genuinely interested in the family he is joining does not need to secretly photograph things in the house. He asks. He points at a photo on a shelf and says, "Who is this?" He says, "That's a beautiful painting, where is it from?" He is curious in the open, generous way that people who mean well are curious. A man who photographs things quietly is cataloging. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I wish I had seen it." I said, "You weren't supposed to see it. That was the point." She was quiet again. Then, "Dad." "Yes." "Thank you." We stayed on the phone for another 20 minutes talking about nothing in particular, the weather, which had been mild for February, and a recipe she had tried that had not gone the way the instructions suggested, and whether I was thinking about doing anything with the back garden this spring. Small things. Ordinary things. The kind of conversation you can only have with someone when the big things have been handled and the ground is solid under your feet again. I think about Patrick Lorne sometimes. Not with anger, or at least not primarily with anger. Mostly I think about the precision of what he was doing, how carefully he had constructed a version of himself that was designed to be trusted, and how much patience it must have required, and how many times he must have done it to be that good at it. I think about the women in Ontario and Alberta whose names I will never know. I think about the Forum Post and whether the woman who wrote it ever found out that someone read it. And I think about the fact that at some point in the years ahead, Patrick Lauren will find someone else. He will show up somewhere with 2 bottles of good wine and a firm handshake and the right words at the right moment. He will walk someone to their car in the rain. He will be patient and attentive and perfectly calibrated, and somewhere there is a father or a mother or a sibling who will not know to look for the signs until it is too late. That is the part one cannot make peace with. But what I can say is this: the trust my wife and I built, not the legal document, but the one between my daughter and me, the one that took 34 years of Sunday phone calls and honest conversations and showing up, that trust was what made it possible to sit at that dinner table and tell the truth in a room full of people, and have her believe me. Not because I am her father. Because I had never given her a reason not to. That is the only inheritance that actually matters. Everything else is just paperwork.